She was bleeding inside a supply closet while $1,000 champagne flutes clinked 40 feet away. Alara Voss had spent 4 years making the Hawthorne Gala look flawless. Tonight, she became the thing no one was supposed to see. A woman crumpled against a shelf of folded linen, ribs screaming, mascara cut through a sweat, dress torn at the shoulder where Cameron Vale had grabbed her and reminded her exactly what kind of man he was. Then the door opened, and the most dangerous man in Boston was staring directly at her. If you've ever felt invisible until the wrong moment made you visible, stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The gala had been running for 3 hours and 40 minutes when Alara Voss finally allowed herself to disappear. Not for long. She knew better than that. In her line of work, disappearing even for 10 minutes meant something burned. A catering station that ran out of smoked salmon, a floral arrangement that tilted 6 degrees past acceptable, a guest with a dietary restriction who had been handed the wrong plate. The Hawthorne family did not tolerate visible failure. What they tolerated was a different matter entirely, but failure that guests could see, that was unforgivable. She slipped through the service corridor behind the East Ballroom, past the stacked silver trays and the waitstaff moving in tight, practiced formation, and pushed open the door to the third-floor supply closet. She had memorized this room the way she memorized every room in the Hawthorne estate, not because she was obsessive, though perhaps she was, but because knowing where to disappear was a survival skill she had developed long before she ever set foot in a place like this. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, her left hand found her ribs. She pressed lightly and had to bite down on the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound she couldn't take back. Broken. At least one. Maybe two. She'd known it the moment Cameron Vale had shoved her into the alcove behind the wine storage, known it when his forearm had connected with her side in that deliberate, practiced way that told her this wasn't temper. This was intention. Cameron Vale was 27 years old and had never been told no by anyone who mattered, and the way he had looked at her in the 45 seconds before she'd wrenched free and run told her that tonight he had decided she would be the next lesson in consequences. She had run. That was something. Her dress was not as lucky. The champagne silk had torn at the left shoulder, a 4-inch gash that couldn't be pinned and couldn't be explained. Her hair had come half down. There was a red mark on the inside of her right wrist where his grip had been, already darkening toward purple. And when she looked at herself in the small square mirror mounted above the supply shelves, she did not recognize the woman looking back. She looked like someone who needed help. Alara Voss did not ask for help. She had built her entire career, her entire identity, on not needing it. She unzipped the emergency kit she kept in her blazer pocket, a habit from her first year coordinating events, when she'd learned that everything could go wrong and usually did, and found the safety pins. 3 of them. She started working the torn fabric back together with fingers that weren't entirely steady, breathing through her nose, counting the inhales the way her sister had taught her years ago when panic was something they both had to manage regularly. In through the nose. 4 counts. Hold 2. Out through the mouth. 6. Her sister, Maya, whose hospital bill from last month still sat on Alara's kitchen table, underneath a coffee mug she'd stopped being able to afford to refill. The treatment was working. The doctors had said so, but working was not the same as finished, and finished was not the same as paid for. And Alara had 3 more months of event contracts with the Hawthorne family before she could realistically look at other options. 3 more months. She just had to get through 3 more months. She had the second safety pin almost secured when the door opened. She didn't scream. That was the thing she would remember later, that her first instinct was not to scream, but to press herself back against the shelf, to make herself smaller, to brace. 4 years of learning to be invisible in rooms full of people who would have preferred she stayed that way, and her body's response to a sudden threat was to shrink. The light from the corridor cut in hard, and for a half second she was nothing but blinded. Then her vision adjusted. Damien Hawthorne stood in the doorway. He was taller than she always remembered, even though she had been in his proximity dozens of times. Something about encountering him in small spaces did that, made him fill the available geometry in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't quite not threatening either. He was in his full gala attire. Charcoal jacket, no tie tonight, collar open at the throat, which was the only visible concession he made to anything resembling informality. His face was the face that appeared in quarterly financial reports and very occasionally in gossip columns, always described the same way: sharp, controlled, unreadable. He was staring at her, not at her torn dress, though she could see the moment his eyes caught the safety pins and understood them, not at the emergency kit still open in her hands, at her face, at whatever was written there that she hadn't had enough time to put away. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then he reached back without looking and pulled the door closed behind him. The click of the latch sounded enormous in the silence. "Who did this to you?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was the shape of a question without any of the uncertainty, and Alara felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the pain in her ribs. "I'm fine," she said. "I apologize. I needed a moment to fix a wardrobe issue. I'll be back on the floor in 3 minutes." "Alara." Just her name. Just that. But the way he said it was different from every other time she had heard it in 4 years of working for his family. Different from the clipped professional acknowledgement at event briefings. Different from the distracted nod when she updated him on guest arrivals. He said her name like it was a door he was holding open and waiting to see if she'd walk through. She didn't answer. He took 2 steps forward, and she had to fight the instinct to step back because there was nowhere to go, just shelving units and folded linen and the particular smell of cedar and old wood that she had always found oddly steadying. He stopped about 4 feet from her, close enough that she could see the slight tension at the corner of his jaw. "Your wrist," he said. She looked down at her own hand before she could stop herself. The bruising had progressed in the last several minutes. Under the closet's single overhead light, the marks left by Cameron Vale's grip were fully visible. 4 distinct pressure points and a thumb-shaped shadow on the inside. "I caught it on a door handle," she said. "It looks worse than it is." Something moved through his expression. She didn't have a name for it because she had spent 4 years cataloging Damien Hawthorne's expressions for professional purposes. Reading a room meant reading the most important person in it, and she had never seen this particular one before. "You're holding your ribs with your other hand," he said. She realized, with a cold shock, that she was. Her left hand had drifted back to her side without her noticing, pressing lightly against the place that screamed every time she drew a full breath. She dropped her hand. "Mr. Hawthorne." "Stop." He said it quietly. Not sharp, not commanding, just certain. The way a man speaks when he has decided that the conversation being attempted is one he will not participate in. "I've watched you work events in this house for 4 years. I've watched you de-escalate drunk guests, cover for incompetent staff, smile at people who spoke to you like you were furniture. I have never once seen you go to ground in a supply closet." He paused. "Who did this to you?" The rib moved when she breathed. She was very aware of it. She was aware of the safety pins holding her dress together, of her hair coming loose on the left side, of the particular humiliation of being seen like this by this man, who represented the professional world she had spent everything she had to earn a place in. She thought about Maya's hospital bill on the kitchen table. She thought about 3 more months. "Cameron Vale," she said. And then she hated herself for how small her voice came out when she said it. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The earlier silence had been watchful. This one had an edge to it. Damien Hawthorne's face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. Something that she associated with the stories she'd heard, the ones the catering staff whispered when they thought she wasn't close enough to hear, about what happened to people who crossed Damien Hawthorne in ways that actually mattered to him. "Where is he now?" Damien said. "Please don't do anything." The words came out faster than she intended. "I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking, but Cameron Vale's father has a relationship with your board. And if this becomes something, if it becomes a scene, the story won't be about what he did. It'll be about the disruption. That's how it always works. And I can't—" She stopped, swallowed. "I cannot afford to be the disruption. I need the rest of this contract. I need the next one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your sister," he said. The word hit her like a physical thing. "How do you know about Maya?" she said. It came out flat, stripped of anything professional. I know more about the people who work in my house than most of them realize. It wasn't apologetic the way he said it, just factual. I know you've been supporting her treatment for 2 years. I know the expenses have increased. I know you took this contract specifically because of the year-end bonus structure. He looked at her directly. I also know that none of that is a reason to let a man who assaulted you walk back into a ballroom full of people and finish his champagne. Something broke open in her chest that wasn't the rib. She had expected many reactions from Damien Hawthorne in this situation. Annoyance at the disruption, detached professionalism, possibly even a version of sympathy that was really just risk management. She had not expected this. She had not expected to feel in the low light of a supply closet in a house where she had always been invisible, like someone was finally looking at her as if she was the kind of person whose pain counted. She did not cry. She had gotten very good at not crying in professional settings. But she had to look away for a moment, fix her eyes on a point somewhere near the third shelf, and breathe very carefully through her nose. "I'm not asking your permission," Damien said. Not unkindly. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. Victor is going to take you to the medical suite on the second floor. You're going to let him look at those ribs. Then you're going to rest." He paused. "I'll handle the rest of the evening. The Aldridge table has a conflict with the Henderson seating, and the Morales family specifically requested Alara." She stopped. "I'll handle it," he said. Victor Raines appeared so quickly that Alara wondered if he had been standing outside the door the entire time. Damien's head of security was a compact, gray-eyed man in his late 40s who moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had seen a great deal and learned to respond to all of it the same way, without wasted motion, without visible reaction. He looked at Alara and then at Damien, and then he simply nodded once and held the door. Damien removed his jacket. He did it the way he did everything, without performance, without ceremony. He stepped forward and settled it around her shoulders, over the torn dress and the safety pins, and she felt the warmth of it and smelled cedar and something clean and expensive, and under both of those things, something that was just human, warm. "Don't argue," he said quietly. She didn't. In the medical suite, Victor's assessment was thorough and quiet. He had clearly done this before. Not the same thing exactly, but the category of thing. He confirmed 2 cracked ribs, photographed the bruising on her wrist, and asked her in a level voice whether she wanted to file a report and whether she had people who knew where she was tonight. She answered yes to the first question and not really to the second. He didn't comment on either answer. He gave her something for the pain that was strong enough to take the sharpest edge off the rib, and then he left her with a glass of water and a blanket that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and she sat in the quiet of the second-floor medical suite and listened to the distant sound of the gala continuing below. She thought about Cameron Vale finishing his champagne. She thought about Damien Hawthorne's face in the supply closet, that thing she hadn't been able to name, moving underneath his controlled surface. She thought about 4 years of smiling at people who looked through her. Damien Hawthorne had not looked through her. She was still turning that over in her mind when the door opened and Damien walked in, and she could tell by the set of his shoulders that something had already happened, though she didn't know yet what it was, and she didn't know yet how much it was going to cost them both. "Cameron Vale left the event," he said, voluntarily. The word carried something underneath it that she didn't examine too closely. "What did you do?" she said. "I had a conversation," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away, and she understood then that the conversation had been the kind that ended things, the kind that made men like Cameron Vale understand that the world they operated in had edges they hadn't known existed and that they had just stepped over one. "You should have let me handle it," she said. "You were going to protect him to protect yourself," he said. "I understand why. It doesn't mean I was going to let it stand." She didn't have an answer for that. He sat down in the chair across from her, not close, not hovering, just present in the way of someone who has decided to stay without needing to be invited. He loosened the collar of his shirt another button and looked at the floor for a moment, and for the first time in 4 years she saw something in Damien Hawthorne that she had never expected to see. Tiredness. Not the social kind. The real kind. The kind that came from carrying things for a long time, without being able to put them down. "How long has Maya been in treatment?" he asked. She told him. It came out easier than she expected, the way confessions sometimes came out easier than expected when the person across from you wasn't pushing for them. 2 years of infusion treatments, the first year covered mostly by insurance, the second year increasingly not, the third, the year they were in now, almost entirely out of pocket because the specialist Maya needed wasn't in network, and the alternative was a doctor Maya had already tried and who had failed her once. Damien listened. He didn't offer sympathy, which she was grateful for. He didn't try to fix it mid-sentence, which she was also grateful for. He just listened. "The next round of treatment starts in 11 days, she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He didn't explain. He simply held her gaze, and she understood from the steadiness of it that he had known before tonight, that whatever he knew about her life he had not arrived at casually. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She filed it away. "I need to go back to the event," she said. "No," he said, simply, not cruelly. "You have 2 cracked ribs." Victor confirmed it. "You're done for tonight." "My contract is not a problem," he said. "I'll deal with the contract." "You can't just—" "Alara." He said her name the same way he'd said it in the closet, with that particular gravity, and she felt the same thing she'd felt then, the sense of a door held open. "Let me deal with it." She sat with that for a moment. In her experience, in the experience of every woman she had ever known who had worked in proximity to power, letting powerful men deal with things came with a price. She had always paid her own way precisely to avoid that arithmetic. The idea of owing Damien Hawthorne something was not comfortable. But her ribs were cracked, and her dress was held together with safety pins, and Cameron Vale was somewhere in this city feeling certain he had escaped consequence, and she was very, very tired. "Okay," she said. The word felt like setting something heavy down. She slept in the medical suite, the blanket pulled up to her chin, the sounds of the gala fading beneath her. She did not dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember it. In the morning, there were 3 things waiting for her. A text from Victor containing an address where her car had been brought, a note that her remaining gala obligations had been covered by 2 members of Damien's staff, and an invoice for her remaining contract work marked paid in full. A voicemail from her sister's clinic confirming that Maya's next treatment round had been covered by an anonymous benefactor and that they were scheduled to begin in 10 days. And a single message from Damien Hawthorne sent at 4:17 in the morning. It said, "You are safe. Rest." Alara stood in the kitchen of her apartment with the phone in her hand and the coffee she couldn't quite afford getting cold on the counter, and she thought about the bruises on her wrist, and she thought about the man who had sat across from her in a chair and just listened. She thought about Cameron Vale. She thought, voluntarily. Something about that word had been bothering her since he'd said it. Voluntarily. Cameron Vale had voluntarily left a party where his family had standing, had voluntarily given up the social capital of being seen, had made himself invisible in the middle of a room that rewarded visibility. The kind of man who did what Cameron Vale had done to her in that alcove did not do things voluntarily, not unless someone had made the cost of staying considerably more frightening than the cost of leaving. She set the phone down on the kitchen table next to Maya's hospital bill. Maya's hospital bill, which was paid. She picked the phone back up. She thought about what it meant to be safe, and who had the power to make a man like Cameron Vale understand what safety for someone else actually cost. She thought about the stories the catering staff whispered. She thought about Damien Hawthorne's face in the supply closet, not the controlled surface, but the thing underneath it, the thing she hadn't been able to name. And for the first time, she thought she might know what it was. She typed back, "Why did you do all of this?" 3 minutes passed. Then his reply came. "Come to the estate tomorrow. There are things I should have told you a long time ago." She stared at the message. Outside her window, Boston was starting up its morning. Cabs and delivery trucks, and the particular relentless noise of a city that didn't pause for anyone's private reckoning. She had lived here for 6 years, and sometimes the city felt like the most indifferent thing she had ever encountered. Enormous and loud and completely uninterested in whether she was okay. But last night, in a supply closet, Someone had looked at her like she mattered. She pressed reply. I'll be there. She set the phone down again. Across the city, in a building she had never seen the inside of, something was already in motion that she didn't yet have the language to understand. Something that had begun not last night, but 4 years ago. The first time Damien Hawthorne had watched her de-escalate a drunk guest with nothing but a steady voice and a glass of water, and had felt something he hadn't expected to feel. But she didn't know that yet. She would know it tomorrow. The Hawthorne estate looked different in daylight. Alara had been through its gates more times than she could count, but always in the operational mode, clipboard in hand or earpiece in, moving fast, thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever was about to go wrong. She had never arrived like this. Slowly, in the passenger seat of a car Victor Rains had sent without being asked, ribs wrapped, dress ordinary, nothing professional about any of it. The grounds were quiet. The event tents had already been struck. Damien's staff worked fast, and the back lawn showed only the ghost of last night's gala in the faint compression of the grass where the dance floor had been. Someone had collected every champagne flute. Someone had removed every trace. By noon, it would look like nothing had happened here at all. She knew how that felt. Victor met her at the side entrance rather than the main door, which told her something about what kind of meeting this was. He walked her through the interior corridor, past the estate's working kitchen, where 2 staff members looked up and looked away again with the practiced discretion of people who understood that certain arrivals were not to be acknowledged. Victor said nothing. He had the gift of silence that Alara associated with people who had learned that most talking was just noise used to fill the space where thinking should go. He stopped outside a set of double doors on the estate's east wing. He's been in there since 5 this morning, Victor said. Not as a warning, just information. She nodded and went in. Damien was standing at the far window with his back to the door, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cup of something on the desk behind him that had clearly gone cold an hour ago. The room was a working office, not the ceremonial kind that wealthy men kept for photographs, but an actual room where actual decisions got made, with papers on the desk and a whiteboard on one wall covered in handwriting she couldn't read from the door. He turned when she came in. He looked like a man who had not slept, not destroyed by it. Damien Hawthorne was not the kind of man who came apart visibly, but there were shadows under his eyes and a quality to his stillness that was different from his usual controlled quiet. This was the stillness of someone who had been running internal calculations all night and was not finished yet. "How are the ribs?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "Victor's wrap holds." He nodded once. He gestured toward the chair across from the desk, and she sat, and he came around and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged, the way air gets before weather. "You paid Maya's treatment," she said. "Yes." "That's not something I asked for." "No," he said. "It isn't." "I need you to understand something." She kept her voice level. She was good at level. "I have spent 6 years not owing anyone anything. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice I made deliberately because I understand what debt looks like in this world. It looks like people deciding they have a say in your life." He looked at her steadily. "Is that what you think I want?" "I don't know what you want," she said. "That's the problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to not have to choose between your sister's health and your own safety. That's what I want. You can reframe it as debt if that makes it easier to process. But that's not what it is." "Then what is it?" He picked up the cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "I watched you at the Meridian fundraiser in March. There was a catering conflict that turned into a near-physical altercation between 2 of the kitchen supervisors, and you handled it in under 4 minutes without anyone in the main room knowing it happened." He paused. "The March before that, the Hawthorne anniversary dinner. The main floral vendor canceled 6 hours out, and you rebuilt the centerpiece program from a grocery supplier and a florist in Cambridge who owed you a favor. Nobody noticed." She said nothing. "The year before that," he continued, "my mother made a comment to you in front of her friends that was not acceptable, about where you went to school, about your background. You smiled and you kept moving." He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. I didn't say anything. I should have. I didn't, and I have thought about that a number of times since. The room was very quiet. You've been watching me, she said. I notice people who work in my house, he said. I told you that. That's not the same thing. He held her gaze. No, he said. It isn't. She sat with that. Outside the window, the Boston morning was gray and indifferent, a low sky pressing down on the old stone and the manicured grounds. And she thought about how strange it was to be sitting here having this conversation with this man in this room, when 12 hours ago she had been holding herself together with safety pins in a closet. What happened with Cameron Vale? She said. Something shifted in his face, just slightly. I told you. We had a conversation. I need more than that. Why? Because I need to know what I'm in the middle of, she said. Because Cameron Vale's father is Daniel Vale, and Daniel Vale sits on 3 boards in this city, including one that intersects with your family's interests. And if you did something, then I need to understand the shape of what's coming back. He looked at her for a long moment. Nothing is coming back, he said. Damien. She used his name for the first time. It landed differently than she expected, more personal, more presumptuous, and she saw him register it. I've coordinated events for this family for 4 years. I know how your world works. Men like Daniel Vale don't accept loss quietly. They regroup and they come back with something worse. Daniel Vale, Damien said, has his own reasons to stay quiet right now that have nothing to do with his son. She parsed that. What reasons? Reasons that existed before last night and that I am now aware of. She stared at him. You have something on him. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. How long? She said. Long enough. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than fear. She had worked adjacent to power for 6 years, and she understood theoretically that power at the level Damien Hawthorne operated at was not a clean thing. That the stories the catering staff whispered existed because they were rooted in something real. But there was a difference between understanding something theoretically and sitting across a desk from it and watching it look back at you with tired eyes. I need you to tell me something true, she said. Ask me something specific. The stories about you. She held his gaze. The ones about what happens to people who cross you. Are they true? The silence stretched. Some of them, he said. She nodded slowly. That was at least not a lie. And Cameron Vale, she said. What happened to him specifically? He left the city last night, Damien said. He'll stay gone. His access to the social networks he operated in here has been withdrawn. His father understands that the withdrawal is permanent and conditional on Cameron's continued absence. And if Cameron decides not to stay gone, he won't, Damien said. The certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was simpler than that. It was the voice of a man stating a fact about gravity. She breathed carefully through the wrapped ribs. You did this for me. Yes. Why? He looked at her for a long time before he answered, and she had the sense that he was deciding, not what to say exactly, but how much of the truth to let out at once, the way you open a pressure valve by increments instead of all at once. Because you are the only person who has worked in this house for 4 years, he said, who has never treated me like a transaction. He paused. Everyone in my life wants something. My board wants returns. My family wants stability. My staff wants security. The people I do business with want leverage. He stopped. You asked me once, 2 years ago, at the Lincoln anniversary dinner, whether I wanted my coffee before or after the speeches. Not because it was your job to manage my schedule, because you noticed I hadn't eaten and you thought I might need it. He looked at the cold cup on the desk. Small thing. You probably don't remember it. She did remember it. She hadn't known why she'd done it at the time. It had been instinctive, the way taking care of people was instinctive for her, a reflex she'd developed young. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. That's why you paid my sister's treatment, she said. Because of a cup of coffee. Because of 4 years of watching you take care of everyone in every room you walked into, he said, and never seeing anyone take care of you back. She had to look away from that. She fixed her eyes on the whiteboard across the room, on the handwriting she still couldn't read, and she thought about Maya, and she thought about the bill on her kitchen table, and she thought about Cameron Vale's hand on her arm in that alcove, that precise, deliberate grip, and she thought about the word Damien had used, voluntarily. "This changes things," she said. "You understand that?" "I know." "Between us professionally, between me and this family professionally. If anyone finds out that you—" "No one will find out anything," he said. "Victor is the only person who knows the full picture, and Victor has been with me for 11 years. "That's not what I mean." She looked back at him. "I mean that I know now. I know what you did and why, and I can't unknow it. Which means every time I'm in this house doing my job, I'm carrying something that changes the nature of the job." She paused. "I don't know if I can do that." Something moved across his face. Not hurt exactly. She didn't think Damien Hawthorne allowed himself the luxury of hurt, or at least not where it showed, but something adjacent to it. "Then don't do the job," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Stop doing the job," he said. "Not because I'm firing you. Because maybe the job was never the point." He held her gaze. "Maybe you've been using the job as a reason to be in proximity to the only stable thing in a life that hasn't had much stability." The accuracy of that landed like a hand pressing on the cracked rib. "That's a very presumptuous thing to say," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She stood up. She needed to move because sitting still was suddenly intolerable. Her body's response to something that was cracking open in her chest that she hadn't given it permission to crack open. She walked to the window and stood where he had been standing when she came in and looked out at the gray sky and the ghost grass where the dance floor used to be. "My mother used to say that the problem with letting powerful people do things for you," she said, "was that eventually you couldn't tell the difference between being protected and being owned." Behind her, she heard him stand. "Your mother was right," he said, "about powerful people in general." A pause. "I'm not interested in owning you, Elara. I'm not interested in debt or leverage or any of that. I'm aware that I don't have a clean record on the subject of power. I'm aware of what I am and what I've done." He stopped. "But I know the difference between protecting someone because you want something from them and protecting someone because the idea of them being hurt is not something you can stand." She turned around. He was standing on the other side of the desk, about 10 feet from her, and he looked not powerful in that moment, not the man from the financial reports, just tired and certain and a little bit raw in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen. "You said yesterday there were things you should have told me a long time ago," she said. "Tell me now." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Sit down." She sat. What he told her over the next 40 minutes was not what she expected, which was a version of a story she already knew. The self-made empire, the ruthless ascent, the carefully managed reputation. What he told her instead was the infrastructure beneath that story, the alliances with men who operated outside conventional channels, the ways the Hawthorne name had been protected not through legal precision, but through the kind of persuasion that didn't leave paper trails. The 3 situations in the past decade where someone had pushed against the Hawthorne interests and found that the cost of pushing was higher than they'd anticipated. He told her without drama and without apology, and he watched her face the entire time. She listened without looking away. When he was done, the room was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you asked me to tell you something true." "You didn't have to tell me all of it." "I know," he said. "But if this, whatever this is, if it goes anywhere, I need you to know what you're deciding. I'm not going to let you walk into something without knowing what it costs." She looked at him. "Most men in your position," she said slowly, "would manage the information. Tell me enough to seem honest. Keep the rest." "I'm aware of that." "Why aren't you doing that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I've spent 20 years managing information," he said, "and I'm tired of it. And you specifically—" He stopped, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered through his expression that was unguarded in a way she had never seen from him. "You specifically are someone I don't want to manage." The door opened without a knock. They both turned. Victor Rain stood in the doorway with the particular expression he wore when the situation had changed, and not for the better. Not alarmed exactly, because Victor didn't do alarmed, but alert in a focused, narrow way. "We have a problem," he said. Damien's face closed down instantly. The tiredness disappeared. What replaced it was the version of him that the financial reports knew. "What?" "Daniel Vale," Victor said. "He's calling in a debt. Hargrove on the city council is moving to initiate a review of the Hawthorne East Harbor development. They're calling it a zoning compliance audit, but the timeline and the target make the point clear." Damien was silent for exactly 3 seconds. "When did this start moving?" he said. "Filing came through an hour ago. Someone had it drafted before last night was over." Victor's gray eyes moved briefly to Alara and back. This wasn't reactive. This was already loaded. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. "He knew," she said. "Cameron knew last night was going to go the way it went. He was already, this was already prepared." Neither man contradicted her. She stood up. "This is because of me." "No," Damien said. "Damien, this is because Daniel Vale has been looking for a pressure point for 18 months, he said. "Last night gave him a reason to use it. That's not the same thing as it being because of you." "It's the same outcome," she said. "The outcome isn't settled yet," he said. He was already moving, to the desk, to his phone, to the whiteboard, and she could see the shift happening in real time, the way he reorganized himself around a crisis. The particular efficiency of a man who had navigated pressure before and knew which levers to reach for first. She stood in the middle of his office and felt the ground shift beneath everything. Last night she had been a woman hiding in a supply closet, trying to hold her dress together and protect a professional relationship she needed to survive. This morning she was something else, something she didn't have clean language for. A woman who knew too much about a man who had chosen to let her know it, standing in the middle of a power struggle that was now going to determine whether Cameron Vale's assault on her was going to go unanswered or whether answering it was going to cost Damien Hawthorne something that mattered. She thought about her mother's words, the difference between being protected and being owned. She thought about Maya's treatment starting in 10 days. She thought about the way Damien had said, "I'm tired of it." "Tell me what I can do," she said. Victor looked at her. Damien looked at her. "You don't have to," Damien started. "Tell me what I can do," she said again. Steadier. "I'm not asking to be involved. I'm already involved. That happened last night. So tell me how to be useful instead of a liability." Something crossed Damien's face that she filed away for later examination. Then Victor said, "There's a board member, Aldridge. He was at the gala last night, and he has history with Vale that predates any of this. If someone with a neutral standing and a credible professional relationship reached out to him before noon today, I know Aldridge," Alara said. "I've coordinated 4 events where he was the primary host contact. He trusts me." Victor looked at Damien. Damien looked at Alara. "This puts you in it," he said quietly. "I told you," she said. "I'm already in it." Outside the window, the gray Boston sky had begun to produce a thin, hard rain, and somewhere across the city, in an office she'd never seen, Daniel Vale was making phone calls with the confidence of a man who believed he had found the thing that Damien Hawthorne could not afford to protect. He was wrong about that, but none of them knew yet exactly what it was going to cost to prove it. Aldridge picked up on the second ring. Alara had stepped into the corridor outside Damien's office to make the call, not because she wanted privacy from him, but because she needed to hear herself think, and thinking in the same room as Damien Hawthorne had become, in the last 2 hours, a more complicated proposition than it used to be. She stood near the window at the end of the hallway, watching the thin rain streak the glass, and kept her voice at the register she used for professional calls. Steady, warm, carrying just enough confidence to make the person on the other end feel that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. Alara. Robert Aldridge had the voice of a man who had been in boardrooms for 40 years and had learned to make warmth sound like a decision rather than a reflex. "I was going to reach out to you, actually. Last night was beautifully run, considering the circumstances." She registered the pause before circumstances, and understood that he knew something had happened, which meant information was already moving through the network. That was faster than she'd hoped. "Thank you, Robert," she said. "I wanted to follow up on something that may be relevant to you. Are you in a position to talk privately?" A brief pause. "Give me 2 minutes." She heard the sound of a door closing on his end, and then quiet. "Go ahead," he said. She told him about the zoning review filing. She told him the timeline. She did not tell him about the alcove or Cameron Vale's hands or her cracked ribs, because those things were true, and they mattered, but they were not the currency that moved men like Robert Aldridge. What moved Robert Aldridge was the thing she told him next, that Daniel Vale's filing cited a precedent from the Harbor District rezoning of 2019, which Alara knew because she had personally coordinated the Hawthorne Foundation's community stakeholder dinner that preceded that rezoning, and she had listened carefully to every conversation at every table, because listening carefully was how she survived. And what she had heard at table 7 that night was Robert Aldridge and Daniel Vale having a disagreement that ended with Vale saying something in a low voice that made Aldridge's face go very still. She didn't know what Vale had said. She had only heard the aftermath, but she knew that Robert Aldridge had not spoken to Daniel Vale directly since that dinner. She mentioned the dinner. She mentioned table 7. She left the rest of it implied because men like Aldridge were insulted by over-explanation. The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. "I see," he said. "I thought it might be relevant context," she said. "It is," he said. "Very relevant." Another pause. "I'll make some calls before noon." "Thank you, Robert." "Alara." His voice shifted slightly. Something underneath the boardroom warmth. "Be careful." Daniel Vale is not a man who accepts the word no gracefully. She thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone against her sternum and breathed through the ribs and thought, "I know exactly what kind of man Daniel Vale raised." She went back into the office. Damien was on his own call, standing with his back half-turned, speaking in a voice too low to parse. Victor was at the whiteboard, adding something in the same cramped handwriting she'd noticed earlier. Neither of them looked up when she came in, which she understood as the absorbed focus of people in operational mode rather than rudeness. She sat down and waited. Damien ended his call and turned. "Aldridge," she said, "he'll make calls before noon. He has his own reasons to push back on Vale, and he's been waiting for a legitimate opening." Damien looked at her for a moment. "How did you know about his history with Vale?" "Table 7, she said. "The Harbor District Stakeholder Dinner, 2019. I was 15 feet away." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile in a man who smiled more easily. "You remember table arrangements from 4 years ago?" "I remember everything," she said. "It wasn't a boast, just a fact, delivered the same way he delivered his own facts, without decoration." Victor capped his marker. "The filing is real, but it's thin. Hargrove pushed it through on a procedural angle that's got maybe 3 weeks of traction before it gets buried in committee. The problem isn't the filing itself. The problem is what Vale does while Hargrove runs interference." "Which is what?" Alara said. Victor glanced at Damien. Damien said, "Vale has a secondary move. He's been building a narrative with 2 journalists, one at the Globe, one independent, about Hawthorne business practices in the East Harbor development. The zoning review gives the story a news hook. Without it, the story was gossip. With it, it becomes investigative." "Is the story true?" Alara said. The question landed in the room with the particular weight of a question that people in this world did not usually ask directly. Damien held her gaze. "Parts of it." She nodded. She had expected that. "Then the play isn't suppression," she said. "Suppression feeds it. The play is to get ahead of the true parts and control the frame before the journalists do." Victor looked at Damien again, this time with something that Alara read as recalibration, the expression of a man updating an assessment he'd held for a while. "That requires someone who can speak credibly to the community impact side of the development," Victor said. "Someone with standing that isn't Hawthorne adjacent." "The stakeholder coalition," Alara said. "The community board that signed off on the original development plan. They're real people with real investment in the project. If they speak first and speak clearly, the journalists have to engage with them before they can run the veil narrative. Organizing that in 72 hours, Victor started. Is not easy, Alar said. But I know 3 of the 7 coalition chairs personally from the event work. Give me a contact list in 2 hours. The room was quiet. Damien said, You're running point on my defense. Someone has to, she said. You're too close to it, and Victor is too visibly your person. I'm, currently, the most useful neutral party in this room. You're not neutral, Damien said. Not accusingly, just precisely. No, she agreed. But I can appear neutral, which is the same thing in this context. The rain had intensified against the window. Somewhere below, she heard the estate's main door open and close, a burst of wind, and then silence. The house absorbed it. Damien crossed to the desk and pulled a file from the second drawer. He placed it in front of her. Inside was a contact sheet, a summary of the East Harbor development timeline, and a set of financial disclosures that she suspected very few people outside this room had seen. Read it first, he said. All of it. Then decide if you still want to make those calls. She looked up at him. You're giving me an exit, she said. I'm giving you information, he said. What you do with it is your choice. She opened the file. She read for 22 minutes. Damien moved around the office doing other things, calls, the whiteboard, a brief exchange with Victor at the door, and left her to it without hovering, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. The development was largely what it appeared to be: community investment, legitimate construction, genuine job creation. The parts that were true in Vale's narrative were the parts about the financing structure in the first 18 months, a set of arrangements that were legal but leveraged, built through relationships with 2 private equity groups that operated in the gray border between conventional finance and something considerably less conventional. It wasn't clean. It wasn't criminal. It was the kind of thing that looked bad in a newspaper headline and required 3 paragraphs of context to not look bad. And newspapers did not often run 3 paragraphs of context before the headline. She closed the file. I'll make the calls, she said. She spent the next hour and 40 minutes on her phone, moving from the corridor to the small sitting room off the main hall when she needed to pace. She reached 2 of the 3 coalition chairs directly and left precise, carefully worded messages for the 3rd. She did not mention Damien by name in any of the calls. She talked about the development, the community impact, the way a procedural audit could weaponize the appearance of wrongdoing when no actual wrongdoing existed. And she asked each person a version of the same question. If a journalist calls you, what do you want to say first? By 11:40, she had 2 confirmed commitments to speak on the record and a 3rd pending. She went back to the office. Victor was there. Damien was not. Where is he? She said. Victor's expression gave her the answer before he did. He went to meet with someone, Victor said. Directly. Who? Daniel Vale. She went very still. He went alone, she said. He went with 2 of his people. Victor. She put the name down hard. You let him walk into a meeting with the man who set this up, while we were here managing the edges of it, without telling me. It's not my role to tell you Damien's movements, Victor said, even-toned, not defensive. It should have been someone's role, she said. She sat down because standing was suddenly requiring more effort than it should, and she pressed her hand against the wrapped ribs and breathed through 4 counts the way Maya had taught her. And she thought about what it meant that Damien had walked out while she was making calls on his behalf. It meant he trusted her enough to leave her running it. It also meant he had decided to do something he hadn't wanted her to see. The distinction between those 2 things felt very important, and she couldn't resolve it. Victor's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, because Victor Raines did not do dramatic, but there was a narrowing around his eyes and a particular set to his mouth that she had not seen before. What? She said. He turned the phone so she could read the screen. It was a text from a number not saved in his contacts. 4 words. Check the Globe website. She had her own phone out before Victor moved. She pulled up the Globe and found it in under 10 seconds because it was already the 2nd item on the page. Not the zoning review, not the East Harbor development, but something she had not anticipated, something that landed in her chest with the specific impact of a thing that cannot be untrue once you have seen it. The headline read, Hawthorne airs shadow deals, assault allegations, and organized crime ties surface. Amid harbor development scrutiny, the byline was the independent journalist. The story had been filed 40 minutes ago. She read fast. The zoning review was the frame, as Damien had predicted, but the story itself was not about the development financing. The story was about Cameron Vale's assault on a Hawthorne employee. Her, unnamed, but described with enough specificity that anyone who had been at the gala could identify her. And Damien's subsequent actions, which the journalist described as extrajudicial intimidation and possible coordination with organized criminal enterprises operating in the greater Boston area. The story cited two sources, both anonymous. One of them knew about the supply closet. She put the phone down very carefully on the desk. The supply closet. The number of people who knew what had happened in the supply closet could be counted on one hand. Her, Damien, Victor, the medical staff who had treated her. But Victor had vetted them personally, she knew that. She looked at Victor. He was already looking at her. "Who knew about the closet?" she said. His jaw tightened. 4 people total. You, Damien, me. Margaret, who handled the medical assessment. "Is Margaret? She's been with this family for 9 years," he said. "It's not Margaret." "Then it's one of us 3, she said. "Or someone who was in a position to see what happened before I got to the closet." The thought arrived fully formed, and she wished it hadn't. "Cameron Vale," she said. "He knew where I went. He knew what condition I was in when I left that alcove. He knew Damien would respond." She stopped. The shape of it was becoming visible. This was never about the zoning review. The zoning review is noise. The real play is this story. Get Damien on record as someone who uses criminal methods to protect a woman he has a personal interest in. Make me the evidence of his exposure. Make the assault the thing that pulls him out of the shadows and into the light. Victor was quiet. "This was planned," she said. "Cameron Vale planned to assault me, knowing Damien would react, knowing the reaction would be the story." The words came out of her mouth, and she heard them and understood them and felt something cold and precise replace the shock that had been sitting in her chest for the last 3 minutes. She had not been a victim of opportunity. She had been a target chosen specifically because of her relationship to Damien Hawthorne, a relationship that, until last night, she would have described as professional and nothing more, which meant someone had understood the nature of that relationship more clearly than she had. Someone had been watching Damien watch her for how long? Victor's phone buzzed again. He looked at it, and this time he moved, stood up toward the door. "Damien?" he said. Not to her. Into his phone. "We need you back here now." The story ran. A pause. "Yes." "Read it." Another pause, longer. "There's something else." Alara just identified the mechanism. It wasn't reactive, it was staged. He listened. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there. "I'll tell her." He lowered the phone. She waited. "Damien says to stay in the estate," Victor said. "Don't go outside. Don't take calls from numbers you don't recognize." "What isn't he telling you to tell me?" she said. Victor was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that there was something. "Victor." "The journalist's second source," he said. Damien recognized the description of what was said, the phrasing, the specific details about his history, the things in the story that go beyond Cameron Vale and the gala. He stopped. "There are things that only someone close to him would know." The room was very quiet. "How close?" she said. "Family close," Victor said. She heard it, and she understood it, and she sat very still while the understanding moved through her like cold water finding the lowest point. Family. The Hawthorne family. The family she had worked for, professionally and carefully, and with complete discretion, for 4 years. The family whose events she had managed and whose guests she had protected, and whose disasters she had quietly prevented from becoming visible. One of them had fed the story. One of them had known about Damien and had known about her and had decided that last night, when everything broke open, was the moment to use what they knew. "Which one?" she said. Victor looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that the answer he was about to give was going to change the architecture of everything she thought she understood about the last 4 years. His brother, Victor said, Thomas Hawthorne. She had coordinated Thomas Hawthorne's engagement party. She had managed the seating for his rehearsal dinner. She had spent 3 days working alongside his personal assistant to ensure that his wedding, the Hawthorne family event of the decade, the one that had made her career in this world, went without a single visible flaw. Thomas Hawthorne had shaken her hand afterward and said she was the best in the business. She had thanked him. She thought about that handshake now and felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not betrayal exactly, because betrayal required a relationship, and what she'd had with Thomas Hawthorne was professional, and not quite rage. Though rage was present at the edges, but something more fundamental than both of those things. The particular vertigo of discovering that you have been operating with an incomplete map of the territory you thought you understood. She stood up. "Where's Thomas now?" she said. "Unknown," Victor said. "He didn't come to the gala last night. Damien noted the absence, but didn't—" Victor stopped. Didn't think to question it until now. She moved to the window. The rain had gotten heavier. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and thought about the supply closet and Cameron Vale's practiced grip and the way none of it had felt random even at the time, but she had told herself it was random because the alternative was worse. The alternative was this: that she had been placed in that alcove. That Cameron Vale had known she would be there, alone, between 8:40 and 9, because her schedule placed her in the East Wing service corridor at that time, every gala, every event, because it was in the detailed event timeline that she submitted to the Hawthorne family office 2 weeks before every function. Thomas Hawthorne had access to those timelines. "He knew where I'd be," she said. Her voice came out flat. "Thomas gave Cameron my schedule." Victor said nothing, which was confirmation. She turned from the window. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. Inside her chest, everything was reorganizing itself around this new geometry, painful and necessary like bone resetting, and her hands were steady. "Damien doesn't know yet," she said. "Not the full picture. He knows Thomas is the source, but he doesn't know Thomas gave Cameron the schedule." "He will when he gets back," Victor said. "How long has Thomas wanted to damage him?" she said. Victor looked at her for a long moment. "That's a conversation for Damien." "I'm asking you." Another pause. Then, "Long enough that this wasn't improvised. Long enough that when an opportunity presented itself, he had pieces already in position." She thought about what it cost to have pieces in position. The patience of it. The sustained cold intention of watching your brother and waiting for the right fault line. She thought about Damien's face this morning. The tiredness. The raw admission. The way he had told her things he said he was tired of managing. He was going to walk back into this estate and find out that the person who had broken his most carefully constructed silence was his own brother. And he was going to find out that she had been the instrument used to do it. Not a victim. An instrument. She felt the shape of what was coming and understood that there was no version of the next several hours that did not require her to make a choice she could not take back. She could leave. She could walk out of the Hawthorne estate right now, take her cracked ribs and her incomplete knowledge and remove herself from a situation that had already cost her more than she had agreed to pay. The story had her in it, but unnamed. She could plausibly maintain distance, protect her career, go back to the life she had been building before a supply closet door opened and changed the geometry of everything. She could leave. She thought about Damien coming back through that door. She thought about him finding out about Thomas. She thought about him finding out alone. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. She looked at it and did not pick up because Victor had told her not to, because she was still following the instructions of a man who was not here. It buzzed again. On the third buzz, she picked it up. "Miss Voss?" The voice on the other end was male, dry, entirely without effect. Not Cameron, not Thomas. Someone she had never heard before. "My name isn't important. What's important is that you understand you have approximately 4 hours before the second part of that story runs. The part with your name in it, the part with your sister's name in it." The rib moved when she pulled in a sharp breath. "What do you want?" she said. "A statement," the voice said. "On record, that Damien Hawthorne coerced you into silence about the assault, that the payment to your sister's clinic was not a gift but a mechanism of control, that you were, in effect, purchased. A pause. You give us that statement, and your name stays out of the rest of it. Your sister's name stays out. You go back to your life. She looked at Victor. He was watching her face. He could not hear the call, but he could read her expression, and what he read there made him go very still. And if I don't give you the statement, she said, then the story that runs in 4 hours is not about Damien Hawthorne's business practices, the voice said. It's about you, about the injured woman who accepted money to stay quiet, about your sister's treatment paid for by a man with organized crime connections, which makes the clinic question their own compliance position, which means the treatment stops, she said. The treatment becomes complicated, the voice said. Yes. She stood in the middle of Damien Hawthorne's office with her cracked ribs and her steady hands and the knowledge that the choice she had told herself she could make, leave or stay, had just been removed from her entirely. There was no leaving now. There was only what she did in the next 4 hours and what it cost, and whether the woman she was when she came out the other side bore any resemblance to the woman who had walked into a gala the night before believing that endurance was the same thing as strength. I'll call you back, she said. You have 1 hour, the voice said. The line went dead. She set the phone down. Victor said, Tell me. She told him. When she finished, the room was very quiet, and outside the rain came down in gray sheets against the Boston morning, and somewhere across the city, Damien Hawthorne was sitting across from Daniel Vale, not knowing that the real war had never been about the harbor development at all. It had been about the one thing he had let himself need, and the brother who had watched him need it and decided to burn it down. Victor moved first. He was on his phone before Alara finished the last sentence, turning toward the window, his voice dropping to something she could not hear over the sound of the rain and her own pulse. She stood in the middle of the office and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of feeling the full weight of what had just landed on her. The threatened story, Maya's name, the clinic, the 4-hour window. And then she put it somewhere internal and closed the door on it, because 30 seconds was all she could afford, and the rest of it would have to wait. Victor ended his call. Damien is on his way back, he said. 12 minutes. Did you tell him? I told him it escalated, not the specifics. Victor's gray eyes were fixed on her with an assessment quality that she had grown familiar with over the past 18 hours. You held the call together. I've handled difficult calls before, she said. Not like that. She didn't respond to that. She went to the desk and sat down and looked at her phone and thought about the voice on the other end. Its dryness, its precision, the complete absence of any negotiating affect. That was not a man improvising. That was a man delivering a pre-written script, which meant the script existed before she picked up the phone, which meant someone had anticipated her being in this office, in this position, at approximately this time. Thomas Hawthorne had not just given Cameron her schedule. Thomas had given someone else her number. She thought about when she had given that number to the Hawthorne family office. 3 years ago. A standard operational contact update submitted through the estate's administrative portal. She had not thought about it since. It was the kind of detail that disappeared into the infrastructure of professional life and became invisible. Thomas had been invisible too. Until now. She heard the main door of the estate open and then Damien's footsteps in the corridor. She recognized them, which surprised her, the particular rhythm of how he moved, purposeful and not quite fast. And then he was in the doorway, and he was reading the room in the way she had watched him read rooms for 4 years, the quick sweep that cataloged everything before he spoke. He looked at her face. He looked at Victor. Tell me, he said. Victor told him. He did it in under 2 minutes, clean and sequential, and Damien stood in the doorway the entire time and did not move and did not speak, and his face did not change, and Alara watched him absorb it. The story, Thomas, the call, the 4-hour window, Maya's treatment, and she watched the thing beneath his controlled surface and tried to identify it. When Victor finished, Damien was quiet for 7 seconds. Then he walked to the desk and sat down in the chair across from her, and he looked at her directly, and what she saw in his face was not what she had expected. She had expected rage, or the cold efficiency that preceded rage in men like him. What she saw instead was something that looked briefly and unmistakably like grief. My brother, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at the desk. His hands were flat on the surface, fingers spread, and she could see the slight tension in his knuckles, the only visible evidence of what he was managing internally. He gave Cameron your schedule, he said. That's the most likely mechanism, she said. Yes. Which means he knew what Cameron would do with it. She didn't answer that because the answer was obvious, and saying obvious things to Damien Hawthorne in this moment felt like the wrong use of the air between them. He looked up. And the call. 4 hours from when they called, she said, which was approximately 20 minutes ago now, so 3 hours and 40 minutes. What do you want to do? He said. She had expected him to tell her what to do. The fact that he asked her instead, that he asked first, before strategy, before defense, settled something in her that had been unsettled since she'd heard the voice on the phone. I want to know what Thomas wants, she said. Not what Daniel Vale wants. Not what the journalist wants. Thomas. Because this didn't start with Cameron Vale, and it didn't start with a zoning review. It started with your brother deciding to end something. I want to know what he's trying to end. Damien was quiet. The estate, Victor said from across the room. They both looked at him. The East Harbor development has a Hawthorne family clause, Victor said. If Damien is criminally implicated, indicted, charged, formally investigated, operational control of the development reverts to the family board. Thomas is on the family board. With Damien removed, Thomas controls the East Harbor project, which controls access to the Harbor District financing structure, which controls... Victor stopped. Everything downstream. It's always money, Alara said. It's money and its position, Victor said. Damien has kept Thomas in a secondary role for 6 years. The estate, the primary business interests, the relationships with the people who actually move things in this city, those all run through Damien. Thomas has spent 6 years in the conference room while his brother takes the calls. Damien's jaw tightened. Not surprise. Recognition. You knew he resented it, she said. I knew, Damien said. I didn't know he'd... He stopped. Something moved in his face. I didn't know he'd use you. The word you landed differently than she expected. Not professionally. Something more exposed than that. He didn't use me, she said. He used the fact that you... She stopped, chose the next words carefully. He used your reaction to what happened to me. That's different. I'm not the weapon. Your investment in what happens to me is the weapon. Damien looked at her for a long moment. That's a precise way to put it, he said. I'm trying to be precise, she said, because the next 3.5 hours require precision, and I don't have room for anything else right now. He held her gaze and she held his back, and the room was very quiet, and outside the rain came down without mercy. Okay, he said. What do we do? She had been building it since Victor ended his call, the shape of it, the sequence. She laid it out for them both, not tentatively, not with the professional deference she had used in Damien's world for 4 years, but directly, because there was no time for deference and the situation required someone to think faster than the other side expected. The statement the anonymous voice had requested was a trap with one entrance and no exits. Give it, and the story ran anyway, just with her as willing participant rather than victim. She had understood that the moment the voice laid out its terms. You did not offer a woman protection in exchange for testimony and then keep your word. You took the testimony and used it to make the original story worse. So the statement was not an option. What was an option was Thomas. Thomas Hawthorne had moved carefully for 6 years, building his position on the family board, cultivating relationships with the men who circled the Hawthorne empire without ever being fully inside it. Men like Daniel Vale, men who understood that Damien's power was real, but that real power always had a human perimeter, and human perimeters had weak points. Thomas had found Alara as the weak point and had spent, how long she didn't know yet, months probably, maybe longer, building a mechanism to use her. But mechanisms had builders, and builders left traces. The administrative portal, she said, the one where I submitted my contact information 3 years ago. Who has access to that? Victor answered without hesitation. Family members, senior estate staff, the administrative coordinator. 6 people, total. Can you pull the access logs for the past 18 months, she said. Specifically who accessed my file and when. Victor was already on his phone. She looked at Damien. Thomas gave Cameron my schedule. But to give Cameron that information, Thomas had to have pulled it from somewhere, because Cameron Vale has no legitimate access to Hawthorne event operational files. The pull will be logged. If the logs show Thomas accessing my file in the 2 weeks before the gala, it's not criminal, Damien said. It's not even irregular. He's on the family board. He has access rights. It's not criminal, she agreed, but it's a pattern. And patterns tell a story that's more credible than a 4-hour deadline and an anonymous phone call. She paused. I want to call the journalist. Damien went very still. The independent one, she said, not the Globe. The independent journalist who filed the story this morning. The one Daniel Vale built his relationship with over time, which means she has her own investment in the story, which means she's not purely Vale's instrument, which means she has journalistic instincts that might respond to a better story than the one she was handed. What better story? Damien said. A family member who staged an assault on an employee using a third party, she said, in order to manufacture a scandal that would allow him to seize control of a billion-dollar development project. That story. She looked at him steadily. That's not a story about you. That's a story about Thomas. And it's true. The room absorbed that. Damien's face had gone somewhere she couldn't fully read. She thought about what it cost him to sit in a chair and listen to a woman he had known for 4 years outline the case against his brother, and she did not look away from it. He's still your brother, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to decide what that means right now. I'm asking you to decide whether what he did gets to stand. Damien's hands on the desk. Still flat, still controlled. Make the call, he said. Victor's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Access logs. Thomas pulled your file 4 times in the last 6 weeks. Most recently, 11 days ago. 11 days ago. 2 days after Alara had submitted the updated event timeline for the gala. She picked up her phone. The journalist's name was Sarah Kren, and her number was in the Globe Stories byline contact footer, and she answered on the 3rd ring with the alert, slightly guarded tone of someone who had been fielding calls all morning. Ms. Kren, Alara said. My name is Alara Voss. I'm the unnamed woman in the story you co-filed this morning. I have documentation, a witness, and a timeline that reframes the story you were given. I have 3 hours and 20 minutes before your source makes another move. I'd like to talk. Silence on the other end. 3 full seconds. Then, where are you? Damien's car made it to Kren's office in 19 minutes, rain-slicked streets, and Victor driving with the focused aggression of a man who understood that 19 minutes was already longer than ideal. Alara sat in the back with Damien and the file from his desk and her phone and the specific physical sensation of cracked ribs in a moving vehicle, which was its own kind of clarifying. Damien said nothing for the first 10 minutes. She didn't try to fill it. Then, my brother and I used to run along the harbor, early mornings, before everything else started. He was looking out the window. His voice was even. He stopped about 4 years ago, said he didn't have time. A pause. I thought it was work. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the line of his throat, the particular exhaustion of a man doing the math on how long he missed something that was already gone. I'm sorry, she said. He turned and looked at her. Whatever was in his face was not something she tried to name. Don't be. You didn't make him who he is. Neither did you, she said. He looked at her for another moment and then looked back out the window, and they didn't speak again until the car stopped. Sarah Kren was 34 years old and had the sharp, slightly hollow-eyed look of someone who had been in this business long enough to stop expecting it to be clean. She met them in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building in the South End that smelled like old coffee and industrial carpet, and she looked at Alara and then at Damien with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very alert. You understand I can't unpublish what's already up, she said. I understand, Alara said. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to hold the second part. Your source has a financial motive, Alara said. She opened the file on the table. Access logs. Timeline. The development contract's family clause. The mechanism by which Thomas Hawthorne, Damien's brother, and your source's actual architect, benefits if this story lands the way it was designed to land. She placed each document on the table as she named it. This is not a story about a billionaire using criminal methods to silence an assault victim. This is a story about a man who staged an assault on a woman he had surveilled for months, using his brother's emotional vulnerability as the trigger in order to execute a corporate takeover. She looked at Kren directly. One of those stories is what you were handed. The other one is true. Kren looked at the documents. She didn't touch them yet. She was thinking, and Alara let her think, because this was the moment that required silence more than pressure. If I pull the second piece, Kren said, and what you're giving me doesn't hold up. It holds up, Alara said. Victor Rains will provide a sworn statement about the access logs. I will go on record as the named subject of the assault. The clinic that received the anonymous payment for my sister's treatment will confirm the payment structure, which does not resemble coercion because it isn't coercion. She paused. You were given a story built on a woman's pain. I'm asking you to use the truth of that pain instead of a manufactured version of it. Kren looked at Damien. Damien said nothing. He had said nothing since they sat down. He was watching Alara with the same quality of attention he had given her in the medical suite, present and still and not performing composure. Actually composed, which was different. You're not going to say anything, Kren said to him. She's saying it, he said. Kren looked back at Alara. Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. I need 2 hours to verify the documents independently, Kren said. You have 2 hours, Alara said. I need your answer by then. They went back to the car. Alara sat down and felt the rib move and pressed her hand against it and breathed through her nose and did not let herself think yet about what happened if Kren said no. She filed that in the same place she had filed the voice on the phone and the 30 seconds of feeling and closed the door on it. Damien was watching her. You didn't eat today, he said. She almost laughed. That's what you're thinking about. I'm thinking about several things, he said. That's one of them. She leaned her head back against the seat. The rain against the car roof was steady and gray and somehow steadying. Thomas is going to know we went to Kren, she said. Yes. He'll move the timeline up if he can. He'll try, Damien said. Victor has people watching the clinic. If anyone approaches the clinic administratively or otherwise, we'll know before they make contact. And Thomas himself. Damien's jaw tightened. I'll handle Thomas. Damien, she turned her head to look at him. I need to know what handling Thomas means. I need to know before it happens, not after. He looked back at her and she held the look and did not blink. A conversation, he said. A real one. Not like Cameron Vale. How is it different? Because Thomas is my brother, he said. And what he did changes what we are to each other. But I'm not Cameron Vale's father, and Thomas is not Cameron Vale, and I don't settle things with family the way I settle things with enemies. She searched his face for the part that wasn't true. She didn't find it. Okay, she said. Victor's phone went off. He answered it, driving, one hand on the wheel, and listened for 45 seconds, and Alara watched his reflection in the rearview mirror and understood from the set of his eyes that the landscape had shifted again. Thomas is at the estate, Victor said. He arrived 20 minutes ago. He's in the main hall. He's asking for Damien. The car was quiet. He knows we went to Kren, Damien said. Not a question. He knows something moved, Victor said. Whether he knows specifically. He knows, Damien said. Thomas has always known when something moved. He said it without bitterness. Just the flat accuracy of a man who had lived in close proximity to another person's intelligence for his entire life and understood its shape. He looked out the window at the rain-soaked street. Take us back. The estate materialized through the rain, and Alara felt the particular quality of a place that had changed in the last 12 hours. Not physically, but atmospherically. The way the air in a room changed when something irrevocable had been said in it. The main door was open. The hall inside was lit. Thomas Hawthorne was standing in the center of it. He was younger than Damien by 4 years, and looked at today in a way he didn't always, something compressed around his eyes. his posture carrying a tension that Alara associated with a man who had made a large bet and was waiting to see the outcome. He was in a suit that cost what her monthly rent used to cost, and he was looking at the door when they came through it, and when his eyes found Alara, they moved there first before they found Damien, which told her something about where his calculation was centered. He had expected her to be diminished, or gone. The fact that she was standing next to his brother, walking in through the main door without deference, recalibrated something in his expression. "Damien," he said. "Thomas," Damien said. The word between them had weight, the kind of weight that only accrued between people who had shared a childhood and a name and then grown into different versions of what those things meant. Thomas's eyes moved back to Alara. "Miss Voss?" "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. He looked at his brother. "I think we should talk privately." "We can talk here," Damien said. Thomas's jaw shifted. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding about—" "Don't!" Damien said. One word. The room went very still. Thomas stopped. "I've known you for 34 years, Damien said. His voice was quiet and entirely level, and it was the most frightening thing Alara had heard in the last 24 hours, which included a man threatening her sister. "I know what your misunderstandings look like. This is not one of them." Thomas's composure held, but it cost him something. She could see the cost in the micro-tension around his eyes. "You're not the only one who built this family," Thomas said. "I know that," Damien said. "You act like it." Something cracked through Thomas's voice, not loud, controlled, but cracking underneath the control. 11 years, Damien. 11 years of being the one in the room who everyone knows is there because of his name. 11 years of watching you take calls I should have been on, and make decisions I should have been part of, and build a life I should have had access to. "You had access," Damien said. "I never closed a door to you." "You didn't have to," Thomas said. "You just had to stand in front of it." The rain outside. The sound of the estate breathing around them. Alara stood very still and watched two men who had been brothers for 34 years arrive at the place where the word brother stopped meaning what it used to, and she understood that she was witnessing something that had been building long before a gala or a supply closet or a journalist's byline, something that had its roots in a shared history she would never fully see. But she had also been inside that alcove. "You gave Cameron Vale my schedule," she said. Thomas looked at her. "You knew what he would do," she said. "You knew what kind of man he was. You gave him the time and the place, and you let it happen." Thomas's face. Something moved through it that she could not call guilt because it wasn't clean enough to be guilt. It was more complicated than guilt. It was the expression of a man who had told himself a story about acceptable cost and was now standing inside the consequence of it, in a hallway, in front of the woman the cost had been applied to. "You weren't supposed to be seriously hurt," he said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Damien's head turned toward his brother with the slow, precise movement of a man whose entire internal architecture had just been altered by 6 words. "Thomas," he said, very quietly. Thomas looked at him. It was supposed to be a disruption, something that would make you react. "I didn't tell Cameron to—" He stopped. "I didn't authorize what he actually did." "But you knew what he was capable of," Alara said. Thomas said nothing. "You knew," she said, "and you gave him the opportunity anyway, and then you had the story ready to file before the gala was over, which means you watched, you waited, to see what Damien would do when he found out what happened to me, and you used it." She looked at him without blinking. "You used my pain to pull your brother out of cover. You used the fact that he—" She stopped, chose it carefully, "that he cares what happens to me, as the mechanism." The hallway, the rain, Thomas Hawthorne's face. "Kren is pulling the second piece," Damien said. Not to Thomas, just into the room. "The access logs are in her hands. Victor's statement is in her hands. Alara's testimony is in her hands." He paused. "The story that runs tomorrow is not the one you built." Thomas stared at him. "And the East Harbor Clause," Damien said, "gets amended this week. The reversion provision to the family board gets removed. I should have done it years ago." "You can't—" "Watch me." still quiet, still level. You wanted control of something that was never going to be handed to you by waiting. I understand that. I don't forgive it, but I understand it. He looked at his brother for a long moment. Get out of my house, Thomas. And don't come back until you've thought about what you chose to do with 11 years of access and what you decided it was worth. Thomas looked at Alara one more time. She met his eyes and held them and did not give him anything. Not rage, not forgiveness, not the dignity of a visible reaction. Just the steady, level look of a woman who was still standing. He left. The door closed. The sound of it echoed in the hall, and then the estate absorbed it, the way it absorbed everything. The gala, the rain, the years of carefully managed silence. Alara became aware of several things simultaneously. The rib, which had been broadcasting steadily through the last several hours, and was now doing so at increased volume. Her hands, which had been steady all day, and were now not quite steady. The fact that she was still in the same clothes she had put on this morning, and had not eaten since the previous evening, and was standing in a hallway having just watched a man leave a place he would not come back to the same way he had left it. Damien turned and looked at her. She looked back. He covered the distance between them in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of what was in his face. Not the controlled surface, not the version from the financial reports, not the man the catering staff whispered about. Just the face underneath all of that, worn and awake, and looking at her like she was the fixed point in a room that had been moving all day. You need to sit down, he said. In a minute, she said. Now, he said. Damien. Her voice came out rough at the edges. She hadn't noticed that until she heard it. I need you to know that when that voice called and threatened Maya, I never considered giving them the statement. Not for 1 second. I need you to know that. He looked at her. I know, he said. I don't want you to think that I stayed because of the treatment or the contract or any... Alara. Her name. That same gravity. I know why you stayed. She looked at him, and the look between them was the kind that didn't require words to complete, which was new and not uncomfortable, and also the most exposed she had felt since the supply closet, which was saying something. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Sarah Kren. She answered. The documents hold, Kren said. I'm pulling the second piece. I want an exclusive on the Thomas Hawthorne story when you're ready to give it. Alara closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. We'll talk, she said. She ended the call. She looked at Damien. It's done, she said. He let out a breath that was the first uncontrolled thing she had ever seen from him. Not dramatic, not a collapse, just the specific release of a man who had been holding something at sustained tension and had finally been given permission to set it down. His hand came up and she felt his fingers close gently around her wrist. Not the injured one, the other one. And his thumb pressed lightly against her pulse point, the way you touch something you were confirming was real. She let him. Outside, the Boston rain was beginning to ease. And somewhere in the city, in an office she had never seen, Daniel Vale was picking up a phone to call a source who was no longer going to answer, and Thomas Hawthorne was sitting in a car going somewhere that was not the Hawthorne estate, and Cameron Vale was in a city that was not Boston, and none of them knew yet that the thing they had built so carefully had just come apart at exactly the seam they had failed to account for. The one where a woman who had spent 4 years being invisible had decided, in a supply closet, in the moment a door opened, that invisible was no longer something she was willing to be. But there was still one thing unresolved, one piece of the architecture that had not yet been named between them, that had been present in every room they had occupied together since last night, that had driven Thomas's calculation and Daniel Vale's strategy, and Cameron Vale's selection of an alcove and a schedule and a specific time window. The thing they had all correctly identified as the pressure point. It was still there. It had not been resolved by the documents or the journalist or Thomas walking out of the hall, and Damien's thumb was still against her pulse. And she had not moved. She moved first. Not away from him, just enough to create the distance she needed to think, which was a few inches and a breath, and she felt his thumb lift from her wrist with the particular care of a man who understood the difference between holding on and holding still. She walked to the window at the end of the hall. The rain had eased to something thin and persistent, the kind that didn't commit to stopping but had lost the force of its earlier argument. The estate grounds were wet and gray and quiet. The ghost of the gala was gone now. The grass had settled, the last of the service vehicles had departed, and what remained was just the property itself, old stone and old money, and the particular stillness of a place that had absorbed generations of decisions and their consequences. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel the rib, really feel it, without the management she had been applying since last night. It hurt. It had been hurting at a sustained and significant level for 20 hours, and she had been routing her awareness around it the way you routed traffic around a collapsed bridge, functional but inefficient and tiring in ways that only became visible when you stopped moving. She was tired, not broken. She was specific with herself about that distinction, because the difference between tired and broken was the difference between something that recovered and something that didn't. And she had spent enough time in proximity to both to know which one this was. She heard Damien come to stand a few feet behind her, not close, just present. "Victor is going to want a debrief," she said. "Victor can wait," Damien said. "The clinic needs to be notified that the threat to Maya's treatment has been resolved. I'll have someone call them within the hour. The East Harbor Development Board, Elara." His voice, patient and certain, and carrying that weight she had come to associate with him saying things he had decided to say and was not going to be redirected from. "Stop managing." She looked at her own reflection in the wet glass. She looked like someone who had been through something. She had stopped minding that approximately 6 hours ago, which was itself a change she hadn't catalogued until now. "I don't know how to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop permanently. I'm asking you to stop for 10 minutes. She turned around. He was standing about 4 feet from her, jacket long gone, shirt untucked on one side from the morning's movement, and he looked like a man who had also been through something and had also stopped minding. There were lines around his eyes that she hadn't seen before last night, or hadn't let herself see, and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at her with the steadiness that was the thing she had come to trust most about him. Not his resources, or his reach, or the fear other people had of him, but the steadiness. The way he stayed in the room. "Thomas isn't finished," she said. "No," Damien agreed. "He isn't. He'll regroup. He'll find another angle. Probably. And Daniel Vale doesn't lose quietly." "He doesn't," Damien said. "But he loses. That's the part that matters right now." She looked at him. "You're not worried." "I'm very worried," he said. "I'm worried about a dozen things. I'm choosing not to perform the worry for the next 10 minutes because I'm standing in a hallway with a woman who hasn't eaten or slept and is managing cracked ribs through what I can only describe as sheer refusal, and I'd like to be present for that instead of already running the next problem." Something moved in her chest that was not the rib. "You do that," she said. "You notice people." "I notice you," he said. Precise, deliberate. She sat down on the bench along the hall wall. There was a bench, old dark wood. She had walked past it dozens of times without ever sitting on it. And she sat down because her body was making a case she could no longer counter, and she looked up at him. He sat down beside her, not touching, just beside. "What happens now?" she said. "To what specifically?" "To all of it," she said. "Thomas, Vale, the development, the story Kren runs about what Thomas did." She paused. "Us." The last word landed in the space between them and stayed there. Damien looked at the floor for a moment. His hands were loosely linked between his knees, and she could see the slight tension in his fingers, the same contained quality she had catalogued all day, the constant management of what showed. "Thomas," he said, "Thomas and I are going to have to talk. A real conversation. Not today. Maybe not for a while. What he did, using Cameron Vale, using you, that's not something I can understand from a distance. I need to sit across from him, and I need him to explain to me how he got from resenting the position he was in to deciding that what happened to you was an acceptable mechanism." He stopped. "I don't know yet if there's a version of that conversation that lets us come back from it. I don't know yet what kind of brother I have. I thought I knew, and I was wrong, and that's going to take time to work out." She nodded. "Vale," he said. "Vale loses the journalist, loses the zoning review when Aldridge applies pressure, loses Cameron as a functional social and business entity in this city. His leverage is gone. Men like Vale don't operate without leverage. Without it, he's just an angry man with money, which is not uncommon and not particularly threatening in the long run. He could come back at you through other channels, she said. He could, Damien said. People always can. The question is whether the cost is worth it to them. And right now the cost of coming at me is considerably higher than it was 48 hours ago, because I am no longer managing alone. She looked at him. The development, he said, gets restructured. The financing arrangements that gave the story its teeth get unwound and rebuilt through cleaner channels. It costs money and time, and it's something I should have done earlier, but didn't because the arrangements worked and inertia is a powerful force. He paused. I'm tired of things I should have done earlier. You said that this morning, she said. It's still true, he said. They sat in the quiet of the hall. Outside, the rain made its thin, persistent argument against the windows. And us, she said. He turned his head and looked at her directly. I told you this morning that I've watched you for 4 years, he said. I told you what I saw. I'm not going to repeat it because you have a good memory, and I don't think the content has changed in the last 12 hours. He held her gaze. What I didn't tell you this morning, what I didn't get to it, is that I'm aware of what I am. I'm aware that the things I've done and the way I've operated and the life I've built are not clean. I'm aware that being connected to me comes with exposure to things that most people would reasonably want to avoid. What happened today is an example of that. What happened to you in that alcove is, at some remove, connected to the fact that someone correctly identified that I had a vulnerability in you. She started to speak. Let me finish, he said. Not sharp, just steady. I'm not going to tell you that the danger goes away. I'm not going to promise that Thomas was the last of it, or that Vale won't try something else, or that the world I've built is suddenly going to become safe in the conventional sense. That would be a lie, and I told you this morning I'm tired of managing information, including with you. He looked at her. What I can tell you is that I'm changing what I'm building. The development restructure is part of it. The conversation with Thomas is part of it. But there's a larger piece, which is that the version of myself I've been operating as, the one that runs on fear and leverage and the careful maintenance of a reputation that keeps people at a distance, that version isn't working anymore. It stopped working the moment I opened a supply closet door and found you trying to hold yourself together with safety pins. The bench was hard beneath her. She was aware of it, and the rib, and the smell of the estate around them, cedar and old stone, and the rain coming under the door from outside. You can't change who you are in 48 hours, she said. No, he agreed, but I can change what I'm oriented toward. And what I'm oriented toward right now, with clarity I haven't had in a long time, is a life that you might actually be willing to be part of. He paused. If that's something you want, I'm not assuming. I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm telling you where I stand so you have accurate information. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about her mother's words, the difference between being protected and being owned. She thought about this morning, in this office, when he had given her the file and told her to read it, and then decide, the specific act of handing her information and stepping back and letting the choice be hers. She thought about the voice on the phone threatening Maya's name and the steadiness that had moved through her in response. Not the steadiness of someone who had nothing to lose, but the steadiness of someone who had identified clearly what mattered and was not going to let it be used against them. She thought about 4 years of rooms where she had been invisible. She thought about a man who had seen her. I'm not easy, she said. I know, he said. I don't defer. I don't manage my opinions for the comfort of the room. I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will need you to hear it rather than root around it. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. My sister comes first, she said. Always. Whatever this is, Maya is not negotiable, and she is not a vulnerability to be managed. She's my family. She's your family, he said. That makes her adjacent to mine, if you decide that's what you want. She looked at him. I'm going to need time, she said. Yes, he said. And I'm going to need you to be patient with the fact that trusting people is not something I do quickly or easily, and I have very good reasons for that. I know you do, he said. I've watched you have those reasons for 4 years. She held his gaze. Then she reached out and put her hand over his, where it rested on his knee, and she felt him go very still in the specific way of someone receiving something they have been careful not to expect. Okay, she said. Just that. Just the word. But it carried everything she meant by it, and he understood that, and he turned his hand over underneath hers and held on with the same careful, certain pressure she had come to associate with everything he did. They sat there. The estate was quiet around them, and the rain continued its thin argument outside, and neither of them spoke for a while. And it wasn't uncomfortable, and it wasn't uncertain, and it wasn't managed. It was just two people sitting in a hallway, holding on. Victor appeared at the end of the corridor eventually, because Victor always appeared eventually, and he took one look at them and had the grace to stay where he was. Kren filed the retraction addendum, he said from the distance. The second piece is formally pulled. The Globe is running a follow-up tomorrow that contextualizes the original filing as part of a broader story. Aldridge made 4 calls before noon. The zoning review is dead, Damien said without looking up. Thank you, Victor. Victor withdrew. She felt Damien's thumb move across the back of her hand. Just once, just that. And she didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her. And the moment was so quiet and so ordinary and so entirely unlike anything that had happened in the last 24 hours that she almost didn't know what to do with it. She let it be. 3 days later, Alara sat in a chair beside Maya's treatment bed in the infusion suite on the 3rd floor of the clinic on Commonwealth Avenue, and she watched her sister's face in the particular way she had been watching it for 2 years, cataloging color, cataloging breath, cataloging the specific quality of tired that was treatment tired versus sick tired, which were different, and which she had become expert at distinguishing. Maya was 31 years old and had their mother's eyes and a stubbornness that Alara had spent most of her life pretending to find exasperating while privately depending on it completely. She was reading a novel with the book propped on her knee and the IV line running up her arm, and she had said approximately 40 minutes ago when Alara had told her the full story, the gala, the alcove, the supply closet, Damien, Thomas, the voice on the phone, the journalist, all of it, she had said, "You held it together." Not, "I can't believe you didn't tell me." Not, "You should have called me." Just that. "I held it together," Alara had confirmed. "Because you always do," Maya had said, and gone back to her book, which was the highest expression of confidence Maya had in another person. The willingness to simply assume competence and return to her own life. Alara loved her in a way that she had never found adequate language for and had stopped trying. Now Maya looked up from the book. "He's outside." Alara looked toward the door. Through the small window in it, she could see Damien standing in the corridor, not looking through the window, not performing patience, just standing in the way he stood everywhere, fully present, not requiring acknowledgement. He had driven her here. He had not been asked to drive her here. He had simply appeared at her apartment building at 8 in the morning in the car, and Victor had been absent for the first time in 24 hours, and Damien had been in the driver's seat himself, which had surprised her more than any other single thing he had done. She had gotten in. He had driven without talking, which she had been grateful for because she had needed the quiet to organize what she was going to say to Maya, and he had understood that without being told, and when they arrived, he had held the door of the clinic and then stopped at the entrance to the treatment floor and said, "I'll wait out here." She had gone in. He had waited 2 hours. He drove himself, Maya said. It wasn't a question. She had seen him through the window when they arrived. He drove himself, Alara said. Rich men don't drive themselves, Maya said. This one does, sometimes. Maya considered this. She turned a page. Is he going to be around? Yes, Alara said. I think so. For a while, or... Maya, I'm asking. For a while, Alara said. Then, maybe longer. Maya turned another page. Good, she said simply. You've been taking care of everything by yourself for too long. It makes you rigid. I'm not rigid. You safety pinned your dress at a gala rather than ask for help, Maya said. That's the definition of rigid. Alara looked at her sister for a moment and felt something shift in her chest. Not painful, the opposite of painful. The specific loosening of something that had been held too tight for too long. She laughed. It surprised her. It came out of the space where the rigidity had been, and it was quiet and a little rough and entirely genuine. And Maya looked up from her book and smiled in the particular way she smiled when Alara did something unexpected, which was with her whole face rather than just her mouth. "Go let him in," Maya said. "He's fine where he is." "Alara." She went to the door. Damien turned when she opened it. He had been looking at something on the wall, a public health notice she saw, which was the least interesting thing in the corridor, with the particular attention of a man who had found a way to occupy himself without taking up space that wasn't his. He looked at her face and read it the way he read everything. "She's okay." "She's okay," Alara said. "She wants to meet you." Something moved in his expression. Not the boardroom version of him, not the man from the financial reports. Something younger than that, less certain. "Now," he said. "Now," she said. He straightened his jacket. An instinctive gesture, a small vanity, the first one she had ever seen from him, and she found it so unexpectedly human that she had to look at the floor for a second. "She's going to ask you things," Alara said. "Directly. She doesn't approach things the way I do." "How does she approach things?" "She asks what she wants to know," Alara said, "without the professional calibration." "Good," he said. "I'll answer directly." She looked at him. "You're nervous." "I'm meeting your sister," he said. "Yes." She held the door open for him. Maya looked up when they came in. She assessed Damien with the quick, comprehensive look that she applied to everything: patients, doctors, novels, menu options. And then she said, "You're taller than I expected." "People say that," Damien said. "Sit down," Maya said. "You're making the room feel uneven." He sat in the chair on the other side of the bed from Alara. He sat the way he sat everywhere, fully, without performance. But there was something in his posture that was different from the estate, and different from the car, and different from the hallway bench. Something without the usual controlled surface, just the man underneath. "You paid for my treatment," Maya said. "Yes," he said, "without asking." "Without asking." Maya looked at him. "Why?" "Because your sister needed it handled and was going to handle it at the cost of her own safety," he said. "I removed the cost." "That's a practical answer," Maya said. "I'm asking why you cared whether my sister handled it at cost to herself." A pause. "Because she matters to me," he said. "She has for a long time." Maya studied him for another moment. Then she looked at Alara. Something passed between them in the look. The compressed, wordless communication of sisters who had been each other's primary witnesses through everything. And Alara understood from Maya's face that the verdict was in and that it was, cautiously, not negative. Maya went back to her book. "You can stay," she said to Damien. "But if you try to talk to me during the next 2 chapters, I'll ask you to leave." Damien said, "Understood." He stayed. In the weeks that followed, the city reorganized itself around the new facts in the way cities did, absorbing, redistributing, moving on. The Globe's follow-up story ran and named Thomas Hawthorne in connection with the staged events at the gala, not criminally, but factually, with the access logs as documentation and Kren's careful, precise language laying out the mechanism without embellishment. The story did what accurate stories sometimes did, not the enormous public detonation that had been threatened, but a quieter and more durable damage to Thomas's standing in the networks he had been building for 6 years. Thomas did not respond publicly. He called Damien once, 2 weeks after the hallway. The call lasted 11 minutes. Alara was not in the room for it and did not ask what was said. Damien came out of the room afterward and sat at the kitchen table of her apartment. He had been to her apartment 4 times by then, always with her knowledge and always because she had opened the door, which was the specific distinction she had maintained and which he had respected without needing to be reminded. And he drank the coffee she put in front of him and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "He says he didn't know Cameron would hurt you the way he did." "Do you believe him?" she said. A long pause. "I believe he told himself that," he said. I'm less certain he tried very hard not to know. She sat down across from him. That's a distinction that matters. Yes, he said. It is. And I don't know yet what to do with it. She didn't offer him an answer because she didn't have one, and she had stopped performing solutions she didn't actually have. They sat with the question the way you sometimes had to sit with questions. Not because they were unanswerable, but because the answer required more time than the conversation did. Daniel Vale left Boston in the 3rd week, not fled. The distinction was his, and she heard it through the network, the careful framing of a man managing his own narrative, but relocated to his properties in Connecticut, citing family reasons. Cameron Vale did not return. The social networks that had held them in place in this city had been too thoroughly rewritten to recover. The East Harbor development broke ground again in the 4th week after a brief pause for the financing restructure, and the Community Coalition held a press event where 3 of the 7 chairs spoke on the record about the project's impact, and the story that ran was not the story Thomas had built, but a different one, grounded in the actual community rather than in a manufactured scandal. Ilara's name appeared in it, briefly. She had been named as the event coordinator who had originally organized the stakeholder dinner as a contextual detail. She was identified by profession and left at that. She read the piece at her kitchen table and found it adequate. Her phone buzzed. Damien. The piece ran. A pause, then, "You were mentioned." "I saw," she typed back. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about that. Outside her window, Boston was doing what it always did. The cabs and delivery trucks and the particular noise of a city that didn't pause. And she was sitting in her kitchen with coffee she could afford now, not easily, but genuinely, and Maya had a treatment schedule that ran through the end of the year and was showing results that the doctors described with the specific optimism of people who had learned to be careful with hope, but were, currently, hopeful. "Fine," she typed. Then she thought about the supply closet and the safety pins and the woman in the mirror she hadn't recognized, and she typed something else. "Better than fine, I think." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Good." Then, "I have something to show you. Are you free Saturday?" She looked at the message. "What is it?" she typed. "The estate gardens. They look different in spring. I realized you've only ever seen them set up for events." She sat with that for a moment. The estate gardens. The place where she had always been behind the scenes, managing, coordinating, invisible. The place where she had been a professional presence and nothing more. "I've seen them dozens of times," she typed. "You've worked in them dozens of times," he typed back. "That's different." She thought about that distinction, between seeing and working, between being present for something and being a witness to it. She typed, "Saturday works." Saturday came cold and clear, the particular clarity of a Boston spring morning that hadn't decided yet to be warm, but had resolved the question of the rain. The estate gardens were in the early part of their seasonal recovery. Not the full abundance of summer, but the first real evidence of it. Green coming up through the cleared beds and the old stone paths washed clean by weeks of rain. Damien met her at the side gate rather than the main entrance, which she understood was intentional. Not the professional entrance, not the working entrance, just the gate in the garden wall that opened onto the path along the east bed. He was in a coat and no jacket, and he looked like he'd slept, which was something she had started monitoring for the same way she monitored Maya's color and breath, as an index of the real condition beneath the managed surface. "You look rested," she said. "I slept 6 hours," he said. "For me, that's excessive." "For you, that's concerning," she said. He smiled. Not the controlled version, the real one. She had seen it 3 times now and was still not entirely prepared for it. They walked. She had never just walked in these gardens. She had moved through them with purpose and logistics, with radios and clipboards and the constant background calculation of what was supposed to happen next. Walking without an agenda in a space she had only ever inhabited professionally felt strange in the way that most new things felt strange, like wearing clothes that fit differently from what you were used to. Not wrong, but unfamiliar. Damien walked beside her and didn't try to narrate the garden or explain anything, and she was grateful for that too. They reached the back wall where the old stone bench sat under the elm tree that had been there longer than the current generation of the Hawthorne family, and probably longer than the family itself. And Damien sat, and she sat beside him, and they looked out at the garden and the city beyond the wall, and the specific light of a clear Boston morning falling across everything without apology. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The first time you saw me," she said. "Not the first event. The first time you actually noticed me. What was it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. "You were in an argument," he said, "with one of the catering supervisors. He was wrong, and you knew it, and he outranked you in the context of that moment, and you didn't let it matter. You told him precisely what needed to happen and why, and you did it without cruelty and without deference, and he did what you said." He paused. "And then you turned around and went back to work, and didn't look to see whether anyone had witnessed you being right." She looked at the elm. "That bothered me," he said, "in a way I didn't have language for at the time. Someone doing good work in a room and not requiring it to be seen." "I didn't think anyone was watching," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the part that bothered me." She sat with that. The old stone of the bench was cold through her coat, and above them the elm's new leaves were just beginning, the translucent green of something just becoming itself, and the city made its ordinary noise beyond the wall, and the morning moved around them without urgency. She thought about the woman she had been at that catering argument. Younger by 4 years, newer to this world, sharper in the defensive way of someone who doesn't yet trust that they belong somewhere. She had been right about the catering arrangement, and she had known she was right, and she had made the correction and moved on because the work was the point, and recognition was not something she had allowed herself to need. She was not sure that version of herself had been as strong as she'd believed. She was not sure that performing the absence of need was the same thing as actually not needing. She thought about Maya saying, "You've been doing everything by yourself too long. It makes you rigid." "I let people be invisible to me too," she said. "I've been so focused on not being seen that I didn't see people either. Just the work, the problem, the next thing to manage." "Yes," he said, not correcting her, just confirming. "That's going to change," she said. "I know," he said. "I've watched it start to change." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning light came through the elm's new leaves and landed across his face, and she thought about the supply closet and the medical suite and the office and the hall and the infusion suite where he had sat with Maya's disapproval and 2 chapters of silence with complete equanimity. And she thought about 4 years of rooms and what it meant that in all of them, without her knowing it, there had been one person who was watching. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not dramatic. It was not the performance of a thing, which was what she had always associated with moments like this. The weight of significance pressing down on the moment until it became something other than itself. This was just quiet and present and human, the specific warmth of another person close enough to feel, and it lasted long enough to be real, and then she pulled back and looked at him. His expression was the one she couldn't name, the one she had first seen in the supply closet. She understood it now. It was the face of a man who had expected less. "I'm going to keep making you earn it," she said. "Good," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I don't do passive. I don't do grateful. I don't become a different person because something good happened to me." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "The work is still mine," she said. "My career, my reputation, the things I've built, they stay mine." "They're yours," he said. "They were always yours." "And when you do something that's wrong," she said, "I'm going to say so." "I'm counting on it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at the garden, the cleared beds and the new green and the old stone wall and the elm with its translucent leaves, and she let herself feel the morning without managing it. She had spent 6 years in rooms where she was invisible, believing that the invisibility was a form of power, that not being seen meant not being vulnerable, that self-sufficiency was the same thing as strength. She understood now that she had been half right. Strength was real. Hers was real. But strength and need were not opposites. A woman who needed no one was not strong. She was just alone. The wall the city made its noise beyond was the same wall it had always been. The The city didn't care about her resolution. It had cabs and delivery trucks and its own relentless forward motion, and it was not going to pause for her private reckoning, and she didn't need it to. She had the bench and the elm and the morning light and the man sitting beside her who had looked at her in a supply closet when she was held together with safety pins and seen something worth staying for. She had Maya, who would be at the clinic on Tuesday, and who was reading a novel and who had said you held it together with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had never doubted it. She had the work, which was hers, which was good, which no one had taken from her and no one was going to. She had, for the first time in 6 years, a morning she was not already 3 steps ahead of. Damien's hand was on the bench between them. She put hers over it. They sat in the garden and the morning moved around them and the elm's new leaves made their quiet business of becoming, and the city beyond the wall carried on without them, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left that required words, only the long and ordinary and necessary work of 2 people deciding, day by day, in small and unspectacular ways, what they were going to build. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.